Brendan O'Connor is the author of Blood Red Lines, How Nativism Fuels the Right. What a time to release this book, man. Are you psychic, Brendan?
I don't know if I'm psychic, but thank you for having me on in any case.
Thank you for writing this book, man. I feel like everybody's desperately trying to figure out what's going on. Not that we didn't have a sense of it before, but it really came full force in the last few weeks with the attempted coup. So what inspired you to write this book about nativism and the far right?
So I have been covering the far right in different forms since the end of the Obama administration, and was kind of looking for a way to bring together a lot of the different threads that I have been following. And it seemed to me that nativism and militant anti-immigrant sentiment was one of the things that is an undercurrent of all of the different parts of the far right that I was writing about, from the billionaires and millionaires funding different parts of the Republican Party to the street level, street fighting fascist organizations. So yeah, nativism is kind of one thing that stitches it all together, but it is a very complicated kind of phenomena that I'm trying to look at.
How would you define nativism?
Good question. I would define nativism as a particularly militant form of nationalism that is mobilized by xenophobia and anti-immigrant sentiment in the service of a kind of racialized idea of nationhood. It has a relationship as well to managing labor and managing the flow of different workforces, but primarily it's a kind of nationalist sentiment and ideology.
So when you have these billionaires, which I'm really curious to hear who are these mysterious billionaires backing this, is it so much that they are nativists, as you just said? I mean, what's wagging the dog? Is it is it the nativism, or is it the economic model which is built off of oppression and racism and white supremacy, if I say so myself?
Right. So I think that the prevailing dynamic that has in recent years been disrupted by nationalist right-wing populisms, not just in the United States, but around the world, is a capitalist order that mobilizes racism, white supremacy, nativism as a way of managing the working class in different parts of the world. Nativism in particular is useful for for the bosses in various kinds of industries, because it gives them a ideological tool to marginalize part of the workforce so that it is hyper-exploitable. And I'm talking here about migrant labor generally and undocumented labor specifically. The fact that we have a political regime that allows for millions of workers in this country to be completely excluded from any kind of legal protections, what very few protections exist for citizen workers to begin with, benefits capitalists in industries like agriculture, construction, the service industry, that rely very heavily then on that hyper-exploitable labor. Now, the nativist sentiment, I think, in recent years has kind of developed its own momentum and has kind of reached a kind of escape velocity from the orbit of capital, where now there are nativist ideologies that are kind of prioritizing nationhood and the sovereignty of nationhood against a kind of globalized order of capital. And so you have a sort of rivalry and a contradiction that has emerged within the Republican Party and then adjacent to the Republican Party. And Trump is one symptom of that, but I think it's a much deeper kind of crisis that we're looking at.
You look at the Trump administration, though. I mean, I think or even the coup, what was really strange to me was how this coalition of folks, some of whom are identify themselves with the ideologies of Nazis, And you have folks who are aggressively racist and misogynist. But if you look at, like, just say the Trump White House, Jared Kushner is Jewish. His daughter, Ivanka Trump, is converted to Judaism. Yet then you have Stephen Miller in the White House somehow working. How does this all work together? Do they just put their beliefs aside and say, well, for the good of money and power, we're willing to let this one slide?
I don't know if it's quite as simple as that. I think for the good of money and power, you have different factions and different tendencies that are willing to kind of share power, but they're each pursuing their own interests at the same time. And so you end up with tension and with rivalries. And I think that what we saw over the course of 4 years of the Trump administration was that this kind of nationalist, populist, nativist part of the coalition that then extended outside of the administration to kind of proto-fascist or even just outright fascist grassroots movement was ultimately disciplined by the powers of, like, big capital. That it wasn't able, people like Stephen Miller, as contradictory as their own, like, personal identities and ideologies might be, weren't able to overcome, on the other hand, people like Jared Kushner and the interests that he represented. As for the question of their, like, Jewishness, that's, like, a complicated one that I don't know if I can totally begin to explain, but I do think that's a testament to where, like, direct comparisons to the kind of classical period of fascism in Italy in the 20s and 30s and Nazism in Germany at that time, where those direct parallels kind of fall short. Where in the US we have a different and very complicated kind of racial hierarchy. We're working in a different kind of settler colonial context rather than a, like, European imperial context. So, you know, there are parallels, but it's not directly comparable, I think.
Let's talk a little bit about the billionaire backers. And, I'm sure there are plenty of names that we recognize, but when we say backing the far right, I'm assuming that most often this is the Trump administration as well. I know we're just getting out of the Trump administration, but, he's sort of taken the far right to another level. And I'm asking this because when he was running for president, some of the billionaire backers out there on the right did not support him. And I don't think they ever did, whether it's the Koch brothers who never ended up joining his crew. So who are these specific billionaire backers that are invested in this nativism?
So one of the individuals that my book focuses on is a woman named Cordelia Scaife May, who was, to be fair, not a billionaire exactly. She died with $500 million in her kind of left to her estate. So only 500 million or so. But Cordelia Scaife May and a man named John Tanton, both of whom are now dead, were pretty instrumental in the creation and funding and cultivation of a network of think tanks and nonprofits that have operated in DC and really around the country since the early 80s, translating kind of vulgar nativism and grassroots nativism into a kind of policy-minded framework. And they existed for a long time at the periphery of the Republican Party, and then with the Trump campaign of 2016, were sort of brought closer to power, and then many people from this network ended up staffing parts of the Trump administration, particularly in the agencies that touched on immigration. So that's an example of someone from this kind of elite sphere putting in the funding and helping build out the resources to sustain these kinds of ideas and movements over time. But Cordelia Scaife May was an heiress. Like, she was an heir to the Scaife and Mellon families in Pittsburgh. So her financial interests are kind of abstracted from any kind of industrial purpose. She just was an old lady who had a lot of money and some very dark ideas about population control and eugenics and this kind of thing. When it comes to funding for the far right, I think we need to, other than those kinds of cases, we need to take a kind of broader view. There are examples where you're right. The Koch brothers were always kind of ambivalent about Donald Trump individually. They even kind of held him in distaste. But the networks that they created are so vast that parts of it ultimately did end up supporting the Trump agenda, and the movements around Trump where inevitably there's a kind of confluence of this interest in maintaining minoritarian Republican control that the establishment Republicans are interested in just as well as the kind of far right radicals are. And then the really extreme radicalism of Trump and the Proud Boys and the militia movements. There is less daylight between these things than really kind of either of them want to imply. Each have an interest in kind of pretending like they don't have anything to do with the other, but really they do.
Well, but, I mean, go ahead.
I was just going to say, to kind of put a final point on it, like, I wouldn't want to imply that there is, some kind of like red string that we can draw to connect, such and such billionaire to such and such street fighting fascist organization. There may be some individual cases where there's sympathies, but the broader argument that I'm making in my book is that this is that this is an ideological movement that is developing. And so therefore it's going to be kind of more complicated than that.
I mean, you highlight immigration in particular and the border policies of Donald Trump, but and you note Peter Thiel, who is what is he, probably the most famous libertarian now that exists. I don't know what you would call him. I mean, to me, seeing sort of the next, Trumpism and his form of nativism, whether it goes away or not, let's just say it does go away. Peter Thiel's not going away. And these policies that are interwoven into capitalism, as you note, are not going away anytime soon unless we really crush them in some other capacity. So how do they overlap? How does Peter Thiel and his company and Trump's border policies, how do they overlap?
So, I mean, in a very kind of, that's an example of there being a direct connection, not just between Peter Thiel, funding Donald Trump's 2016 campaign and kind of almost getting him across the finish line in large part, but that the companies that Thiel founded, Palantir, and then other companies that acolytes of his have founded, have very lucrative contracts with DHS, with ICE, with Border Patrol. And so this is this is just part of a wider industry of border security and border militarization that do have a vested interest in extremely militant nativist politics, because they quite literally profit from it. So there are industries that will want to see future Trump-like figures and are more aligned with this kind of politics than, for example, an industry like agriculture that has a little bit more of an ambivalent position where they benefit from nativist politics, but they don't actually want to exclude all migrant people altogether, because then they would lose their workforce. So it's a little bit more complicated.
Okay, so now that the Biden administration has at least promised to change the border policies, I mean, the details are still murky, but at least probably the most egregious post-Obama era immigration policies at the border, just to make that clear. Where does someone like a Peter Thiel go? And his kind, I should say, like other folks who are in that space.
I mean, I think it's hard to say in this moment. Peter Thiel has made a heavy investment in specifically Josh Hawley. He's given him a ton of campaign funding over the years.
Shocker.
Yeah, shocking. I know. But, Hawley's future in the Republican Party is a little bit unclear. I think that we're about to see a period of time where fractures within the coalition that comprises the Republican Party are going to widen. And there's an open question, I think, about whether parts of the capitalist class that have funded and influenced and controlled the Republican Party for decades now are going to abandon it for a Biden-Harris-led Democratic Party that might be more favorable to the, to a kind of global capitalist economic and political system. What complicates that is, as we said before, Republicans have been very effective at entrenching like minoritarian rule. And so they're not going to disappear overnight. So all of that is to say, where does somebody like Peter Thiel go? I don't know. I don't think
I said to New Zealand.
To New Zealand. It sort of depends on how quickly the climate crisis accelerates.
Yeah.
But I think that the Republican Party is going to be, that there's going to be turmoil in the Republican Party, and whether or not Democrats have the audacity to take advantage of that turmoil remains to be seen. I'm not optimistic, but I think it could go in. I think it could go in some very dark directions, and I think Peter Thiel is someone that future Josh Hawleys will be looking to for financial support, guidance, mentorship, and I think Peter Thiel will be happy to provide that.
Which is why the Biden administration and all the Democrats need to crack down now while they have the power for the brief 2 years that they might have the power for. And that we, of course, need to pressure them to do this, because if you want this nativism to go away, I'm glad that you had the money sources. My perspective is kill their money sources for now. So they don't continue. Brendan O'Connor, super fascinating conversation. Would love to have you back on. I feel like we're going to be talking about this a little bit more.
Unfortunately, I think you're right.
Well, it's good for you. Maybe you'll sell lots of books. Brendan O'Connor is the author of Blood Red Lines, How Nativism Fuels the Right. It is published by Haymarket Books, friend of our show, Haymarket Books. Go check out his book. Buy it in all the good book places, like I believe Red Emma's at haymarketbooks.org. You've got it right on screen, and give him a good book review. All right. Thank you so much, Brendan. Thanks for watching and listening to The Nomiki Show. But remember to click like and subscribe on YouTube, and please share on social media. If you're not already a patron, please join us for as low as $5 a month on patreon.com/The Nomiki Show for early and special content. That investment makes a huge difference. We are not corporate media raking in the dough. It's really you guys that are keeping us going. So please consider being a patron. And to our current patrons, thank you so much. We are incredibly grateful to you. We also now have swag. So check us out on thenomikishow.com to get your mugs, your totes, and your stickers.